Here are a few words on analyzing and interpreting data. So far in the evaluation class, we've talked about level 1 evaluations. So we've learned how to create tools in order to get from the students their reaction to the learning experience that they had. We've talked about level 2 evaluations, and we spent several weeks creating questions so that we're able to gather information about how much the students have learned while they're in our class. We even talked about level 3 evaluations. How can we gather data when the student is back in the work environment to see if they're actually using and applying what they learned in class? So at this point, we have gathered a lot of data, but we haven't talked about what we're going to do with that data. A big old pile of data doesn't help you. You need to figure out a way to analyze and interpret that data. So here's basically what happens. There are two kinds of data. There are quantitative data and there are qualitative data. Quantitative data, of course, are numbers. Qualitative data are words. So the essay questions, the long answers that we ask students to give. Here's basically the process that we go through in order to analyze and interpret it. Let's begin with looking at this idea that we want to make sure that we have a systematic approach to analyzing our data. We don't want to just look at the data and make a guess at what it says. We don't want to make assumptions on what it says. We've taken the trouble to evaluate. We want to make sure that we keep that same rigor all the way through the analysis and the interpretation. Let's start with quantitative data. Now, the way that we analyze quantitative data is through statistics. And I know already I've lost a bunch of you just by saying the word statistics. But what we're going to talk about in this week in particular, and a little bit next week, is an introduction to statistics, an introduction to what is the least amount of math you need to know in order to successfully analyze the kinds of data that you will be collecting. So we'll use statistics and other mathy kinds of things, and what we'll end up with are numbers. And we'll do some math, we'll do some statistics on scores, for example, and we'll come up with averages, and we'll come up with totals and other percentages and other kinds of numbers. We might even come up with some pictures. We might turn those numbers into graphs or into figures or tables or some other kind of picture. But it is never enough to just leave it at the numbers. You always want to have words that go along with the numbers. You want to have words that explain to the reader, or that explain to the administrator, or that explain to the leader, whoever it is that you're sharing this information with. You want to have words that explain to them what the numbers are saying. So it's not enough just to present the numbers and assume that everybody's going to understand what they mean. You want to do people the favor of telling them what those numbers mean. So again, it is never enough just to have numbers or pictures. You always want to have words. You always want to have an explanation that goes along with those numbers and pictures. Now, in terms of qualitative data, there are many systematic approaches to analyzing qualitative data. The most common, and what we're going to be talking about in class next week, is putting information into categories and identifying themes from the data. So that's the particular way that we're going to be analyzing qualitative data. And what you're going to get out of that are pictures and words. Obviously, you'll have words because here's what the categories are, here are the themes that we found, those sorts of things. But you may also come up with a picture or a diagram in order to represent in an easier to consume way what the information says. We all know the old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but it's true. A picture really is worth 1,000 words. So if there's a way that you can come up with a picture to illustrate what the themes and categories are that you came up with, what the qualitative data is saying, that's a wonderful thing to do for your readers, for your administrators, for your peers, for your leaders, for whoever it is that you're giving this evaluation data to. And then finally, all of this comes together in a way for you to communicate to people, here's what the data says. So you might be sharing it in a written document, you might be sharing it in a PowerPoint presentation or some other way, but the result of all of this analysis and interpretation is you are able to say what the data says. You're able to share what that big old pile of data actually says. But that's not the end. What you need to do then is to continue on and say, what does the data mean? So we're evaluating for a reason. We're evaluating to see if people learned. We're evaluating to see what students think at the end of a class. We're evaluating to see if people are really applying what it is they learned. So you go one step beyond and you say, what does the data mean? In the context of this class, this learning experience, this organization, this school, what's going on with us in this moment in our environment, what does this data mean? One way I like to think of it is, what is the story that the data is telling us? How do we pull together all of the data and construct a story? When we do our statistical and our qualitative analysis, we very often are looking at separate pieces. We're looking at this question, and then we're looking at that question, and then we're looking at this other question. When we talk about what the data means, we're looking at across all the questions and pulling that information together. The reason that we do that is twofold. One is it is the way that we really understand together, in whole, what the data is telling us, but it's also a way to sort of pre-digest the information so that you can share it with other people in a way that is easiest for them to understand, that is easiest for them to go ahead and then take action on. So that's a little bit about analyzing and interpreting data. From here on out, you'll be learning more about some statistics that can help you with your quantitative analysis and interpretation. And then next week, we'll also be learning about how to put things into categories and themes in a systematic way for your qualitative data analysis and interpretation.